Don't they stuck me in the barracks for 4 years, so.
Ready?
Maybe. Both bags. How's it going? Well, yeah, that's right. That's probably why I'm not.
All right, it is time to get started. We have a big chapter to get through today. So we're going to jump right in and see how far we get. I did post the PowerPoint outlines on Canvas if you want them. I debated it because it's not always the best thing, but they're there. If you want to use them, feel free to print them out and bring them to class with you. They will have the, it's that 3 slides and then place to write notes. So feel free to use that if you want to, depending on your own note-taking style. And they'll be posted before class each week. So right now, chapters 1, 2, and 3 are up there. I think maybe other announcements. Next Thursday's our first quiz. I guess I should tell you that. It will be on Canvas. So on days when we have quizzes, we don't meet in person. You take the quiz on Canvas. That just makes it easier for grading and for timing and stuff like that. It's hard to take a quiz in a room like this. So we're going to save paper and time and do it that way. So next Tuesday we will meet, and then next Thursday you have your quiz to take. It'll be open from like 12:01 to 11:59. So you'll have all day to take it. And I don't think it's going to be that hard, but give yourself an hour, hour and a half, just in case. It may take you 15 minutes if you've read and been here, like if you know the stuff, but give yourself extra time just in case. And remember, you do get to drop your lowest quiz score. So if you do really well on this one, then that's one less you have to take down the road. Any questions about anything? I feel like we've been in school for a while now. We're kind of hopefully starting to figure things out. This is right about the time where the weather's changing, so it's kind of hard to come to class because it's harder to get up in the mornings, and allergies are kicking up. People are going to start to get sick, so take care of yourself. Wash your hands. I'm not even saying that facetiously. If y'all knew what these desks had on them, you would wash your hands a lot more. These classrooms are disgusting. So make sure you're taking care of yourself and keeping yourself healthy, because this is the time of year when that all starts to kind of tank and go downhill. And no one has time to be sick. So let's talk about understanding families. We're going to go through the history of the family, talk about families today. We're going to define family, talk about what their functions are, and talk about some of the research that's been done and some of the ways that we have conceptualized and understood families, assuming we get through all that. If we don't, we don't. But let's run through some of it faster and some of it slower. As we're getting started, I want you to think about when you hear family, and we've kind of talked a little bit about this already, but what does that mean? What does that word kind of like make you think of? More specifically, what emotions do you feel when you hear the word family? And that may change depending on what's going on in your life. Sometimes people hear family and they kind of like feel warm and like, ah, family. And sometimes they're like stressed out. What do you think? Love and care. Okay, so positive, like family's my support system. Okay, what other things come up?
Stressors.
Stressors. There's a lot of pressure to be in a family, right? Okay.
Playful.
Playful? Okay, absolutely. Hopefully. So there's a lot of different experiences. We tend to kind of stereotypically think of families as positives, which is okay, but we need to also acknowledge that sometimes they're not. There's a big thing within the field of marriage and family therapy. We're marriage and family therapists. Our whole thing is family, right? So people assume if they come see us, we're going to try to help them figure out how to get along and stay together. And yes, we do that. But sometimes we also talk about how can you cut your family out of your life for your own mental health. That's the other side of that coin. Family's not always healthy. Family's not always positive and loving and supportive. So when we think of families and when we're working with families, we want to recognize that bias, that tendency that we have, especially if you're in this field or taking a class like this, you kind of have an idea about families being good, and they very much can be unless they're not. So thinking about specifically within your own family, just kind of who was in that family? How many it was like mom, dad, siblings, like traditional family? Not that many of you. How many single parent homes? Quite a bit more, right? How many grandparent homes? Okay. Non-kin homes. People not your family. That might be something too, and you don't have to raise your hand, but your family is made up of who you think belongs in it. You know, people talk about their church families or their work families. So we really have to understand and recognize that it's such a broader concept. And we tend to kind of just assume one thing, but the biggest thing you can do to understand someone's family is what? Ask them. Yeah, tell me about your family. Tell me who's in your family. Instead of saying, okay, what do your mom and dad do? Tell me about your mom and dad, because that's a huge assumption. So when we think of family, we have these typical stereotypes, but we need to be more conscientious of that when we're working with them. Historically, families have been around forever. If you're someone who believes in the Bible, who was our first family? Adam and Eve, right? They began a family. That was the beginning. If you don't believe that, you still believe something, and anything you believe incorporated families in some way or another from day one. It's just a part of our experience. And not just humans. Any sort of living being has some sort of family configuration. You can kind of read through this stuff in the book. It's not super important to spend a lot of time on, but what we have, you know, historically, what is important is this, that when we were historically looking at families, we kind of operationalized it as a family is the unit where someone has dependence on something else. So it's interdependence that really mattered. There's a head of household, there's a matriarch or a patriarch of the family that's then kind of taking care of the younger generations, basically. We see that with insects and animals too, so we can pretty much agree that's part of it. There aren't often family configurations where there isn't someone at the top of the hierarchy. Sometimes it's the wrong person, sometimes it's the 12-year-old, and then we have to figure out, like, okay, how do we shift that? But we do know that no matter what, there tends to be like a hierarchy within families. Marriage is another part that can create a family. We have biological families, and then we have marital families where people have joined two households. Think about the olden days, the dowries, the reasons people got married, to like make their army stronger, to get more land, those kinds of things. But for whatever the reasons were, marriage is another way that families are created. Religious and social groups have had their interpretations about marriages. This one sometimes surprises people. Polygamy exists in certain religions, existed in certain religions, and had a very specific function. Everyone's familiar with polygamy, right? Polygamy, many wives, if you look at the root words. So, what might be the function of polygamy in a family? Why might someone have more than one wife?
Procreation.
Procreation, okay. So kind of furthering your, I don't want to say species, but like your family, okay. What else? Yes?
Workforce.
Workforce, maybe.
Limited resources.
Limited resources, maybe. Okay. Protection too. In Native American and African American culture, polygamy, not necessarily formal arrangements, but more so in the slave trades, we would see it. Because if there was a husband and wife, a married couple who were slaves, and one of them was sold to another place and moved away, someone else in that place would take that person on as a spouse for protection. So it has historical roots in protection, because there is protection in families. So it's not necessarily just for the sexual reasons people think it is. There's actually historical context where that was important. Less formally in some military families, we see a form of this in the past, where if someone was deployed, the remaining people at home kind of circled around the spouse and protected and cared for the spouse and the family while that person was gone. And if they were killed in combat, if they didn't return, that family would kind of take that person into their family. So we do historically know that that's happened, but these days we all think of it as the Sister Wives and the reality show kind of thing, not really understanding that historically there's a lot more significance to those types of family relationships. We've talked a little bit last time about how before we moved to the cities, before the Industrial Revolution, the family ran the farm, so the more the better. So there was an economic reason for having large families. They all depended on each other, they all needed each other. And then when we moved into the cities, when we came into the Industrial Revolution, it became more expensive to feed those families because we had to buy food instead of growing our own, so family units got a lot smaller here in America. And then of course that non-kinship stuff where families sometimes included non-family members because they, just a simple function of we need help, and if we don't have family, then we can adopt someone else's family. And I think we still do that to this day. I think that's something that it's not as formal a structure probably, but we still have that, right? Well, I went to live with my auntie because she was in a better school district. And so, she watched me during the school years, and then I was home with my parents in the summer. We see that stuff happen a lot. So there are a lot of reasons historically why families have moved around, and we're currently constructing those for ourselves about what families look like today. Modern family, we've talked about that last week. These two types of families are important. I would probably put that on a quiz if I were writing a quiz for this class. But the two modern phases of families, I guess you could say, are first the democratic family. So that's where they're separate and private, husband and wife get married, have kids, husband goes to work, wife stays home and raises the kids. This is the Leave It to Beaver type family situation, if y'all are familiar with that show, which are you? I don't even know that show. Oh my gosh. Well, I'll have to think of a newer example. But yeah, basically it's like they're separate versus the companionate family where it wasn't so much like this, like you do this because this is what you're supposed to do and this is the rule book that you follow. It's more like families who build their families based on affection. We like each other, we want to be with each other, we want to spend time together, we have sexual attraction, we get along well, personal happiness, and it says between husband and wife because that still is kind of the heteronormative expectation, but it's really just between spouses at this point, not just husband and wives, it's any marital couple. So can you kind of see those differences there? There may be a lot more security in a democratic family. Because if you're together because that's what you're supposed to do, and you have economic dependence, and you have the person who has defined role of raising the kids and the person who has the defined role of not raising the kids, that can be a little more stable. But this one can be a little more fulfilling because that's when you're kind of choosing to stay together versus just staying together for the sake of the kids or the finances or something like that. So what we tend to shift to when we work with families is helping them to kind of make that decision and to understand, like, why are you in this situation? Why is this relationship something you want to be in? Is it because it makes sense on paper and it should be a good fit and everyone likes them? Or is it because you really get along and you think they're hot and you enjoy them and you have good sex and all that kind of stuff? That one's a lot more volatile, but tends to be kind of what we're looking for in this day and age in terms of actual satisfaction with life versus just like good enough life. And that's a big push right now, is let's have more than just good enough relationships. Questions, comments? All right. Postmodern family, again, read through some of this stuff in the book. I don't want to sit here and read the book to you, but I think these are things that are important. So we got to look at the past to understand our future. And we need to learn from our mistakes, basically. What hasn't worked for families in the past so that we don't repeat those mistakes now. The whole stay-at-home mom, dad goes to work. When dad gets home from work at 5 o'clock, mom has a drink ready for him. He sits down and watches TV. She raises the kids, and then everyone goes to bed. Doesn't work for many people. So we kind of want to understand, why doesn't it work? What is it about that? Other than we can just kind of say like, yeah, it's probably not great. But what we really look at when we study families is kind of the understanding the why behind it. All right, so now I've said this already, but I want to repeat it. How we define family today must be broad and flexible. There is no one definition for family. There's no way in 1 or 2 sentences that we can describe family and incorporate all of the many components that are involved in it. It's just too big. So again, what we have to do is talk to the individual families and understand what it means for them. That's why human research is so much harder than like researching bridges or insects. Because those, there's like an answer, right? In math, if you know math, you get an answer. I get an answer anyhow, but it's not always the right answer. But I know if I follow the formula correctly and I do this, this, and this is the answer. With families, that's not even possible. With individuals, that's not even possible, let alone with a group of individuals. So that's what makes it so hard to do human research. Don't let anyone fool you. Engineering is tough. Like, I want them to do a good job and I want them to work hard because I don't want my bridges to fall down. But it's not nearly as tough as working with families is, because we have no clear answers whatsoever. We can kind of come up with general themes and we can understand stuff, but then when we're sitting talking to someone individually or to a family, none of it may apply. There's outliers for everything. So that's why we do this work, but that's also why we recognize we're not going to get it all. There's no way we could. We're just not capable of doing that. And if people say they are, they just have too big of an ego. So looking kind of at some charts, some of you are chart people and enjoy charts. These are in your book. These are also on the handouts. But kind of looking at even just the past from 1990. How many of y'all were born before 1990? If you don't want to answer, you don't have to. Not many of you. So this is pretty recent for y'all. I was born in 1980, so I'm just like right on the other side of that. But looking at the past 3 major decades when y'all have been alive, mostly, we have these configurations here. And so if you, I know it's hard to see, but this top one is husband, wife, family, household. The next one, this kind of lighter shade, is female household, where the female's head of household. This one's male head of household. 2 or more people who are not family head of household, so they're not married or legally or biologically related. And then these are 1-person non-family households. So even today, even with all the changes that we've seen historically with families, the still primary family configuration is husband, wife, family, household. So that's still the majority. Barely though. It was 55% in the 90s, and that was the whole like Full House, Family Matters type era where we started to see, y'all have at least seen Full House, right? All right. Okay, so in that configuration, that was like really rare, right? Because Danny's wife had died, so he's raising these kids on his own, and then the uncles move in, and I still don't know how they were related as uncles, but they were somehow. And so that was like in the 90s when we're starting to just barely kind of pay attention in the media and be like, oh, okay, yeah, there are different type of families out there. And then in the 2000s, went down a little, went down almost 4% to 51%. And then in the 2010s, in 2010, 48%. So look, it's just like going this way now. So of course we won't know until the next census comes out, but we can anticipate based on this 30-year trend that this group's gonna get smaller, right? That in the next decade, maybe it's gonna be 44%. And as that shifts, everyone has to pay attention to that. Marketers have to pay attention to that because we got to market to the people we want to buy our stuff. And if we're marketing something to a husband, wife, family household, we're going to start missing all these other people who are gaining ground and getting bigger. So marketers need to pay attention to it. Insurance companies need to pay attention to it. How do we handle medical insurance if it's a family where their people are related? How do we figure that out? How do we figure out the media? What is going to appeal to these populations if they're not the standard traditional family setting? So this information is super important. And knowing it can help us to anticipate what the future might look like, but also to just, for our purposes, help us recognize like, oh yeah, families aren't the same as they used to be. So we need to learn more about these one-person non-family households. Why is 26% living alone? Is that something? Does that have to do with mental health? Is that an economic thing? Like, we kind of want to understand the why behind the numbers. I do. That's what I'm interested in. Numbers don't mean much to me. I want to know the stories behind those numbers. Why is it that every single one of these configurations has changed? Is that just the way things are? Can we correlate that to change in people's religious practices? Political? I don't know. That's what I always think when I look at this stuff. Like, tell me more about that.
I even think the next census is going to have a different category.
What do you
It's not
think?
just going to be husband, wife, family.
Sure.
It's going to be partners.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree completely. We can't say husband-wife anymore because what do? We leave out 30 to 40% of our population just with that question. And I also don't believe in the census because I never give them straight answers. I think it's fun to just like, oh yeah, whatever. So yeah, we gotta take this with a grain of salt, but you're right. If it doesn't, our information's wrong. So let's say maybe in 2010 when they did the census, people were like me and they were like, oh yeah, no, and just made stuff up. That's why there's some statistical measures put into place to try to control for that error, but it could happen. So yeah, our next census, which will take place next year, will be interesting because we're going to continue to see these trends. And then we got to figure out, okay, we need to ask different questions. We can't ask just these questions because what are we leaving out now? Absolutely. Some more numbers. So this is, again, I'm not going to go through all of this, but just look at from the 70s to 2012 when we got this last data. Look at the changes there. You're seeing a, I would say, significant change in married couples with children, going from 40% in the 70s to 19%. That's more than 50% change in 40 years. It's kind of a lot, because if you go the other way and you look at like the 1920s to the 70s, you're gonna see a lot more stability there. So we've seen rapid changes happening there. And again, these other ones kind of fall into place too. So just a different way to look at it to understand, like, we really have changed and we need to figure out why. This is the family size changes from the 70s to now. So families have gotten smaller. And we know that. That's not a brilliant deduction, but some things have stayed kind of steady. Still, we see this variety where 4-people families are holding on pretty consistently. That tends to be still a pretty common configuration for families, but the other ones have changed over time. Living arrangements of children. I like this one because this says a lot when we talk about children of divorce, single parent families, things like that. In 2016, this one was done by the census. So the number of children living with two parents, 50.7 million, and that's children under the age of 18. It's a whole different category when you're 18 and you're not supposed to be living with them anymore. That's not on this. This is just for like legal children. 50.7 million children are living with two parents. And it does say two parents. It doesn't necessarily say mom and dad. The blue is sibling only. The green is grandparent only. The pink is both sibling and grandparent, and then the yellow is no sibling or grandparent. So you can see that there's, even though we say like fewer kids are living in two-parent homes, it's still an awful lot of kids. It's still out there. But we also have a whole lot of kids who are living with just moms, just dads, or with no parents. So those are the grandparents, the aunties, the uncles, things like that. We have a lot of kids in this country. And we need to know what their home life is like. We need to know who they're going home to. We know children who live in two-parent homes have better outcomes. Single-parent homes have greater stressors that they have to deal with, a lot of them economic. So we have to pay attention to that when we're working with families, and we have to understand that because it changes everything. It changes the amount of work we need to do. So there we go. Questions, comments? All right. Variations on the definition. In the census, they define family as two or more people who share a household and who are related by blood, marriage, or adoption. Because they have to have some way to define this. So, two or more people, so we don't consider one person a family. And I would argue if they have dogs, maybe they are, but census doesn't like dogs for some reason. I don't know why. Two or more people sharing a household. So if we're defining a family by the census, you have to live with me. So my mom is no longer my defined family because we don't live together. Related by blood, so either we have genetic links, we have a marital certificate, or you have adopted me or I have adopted you. So that's the way they operationalize it, just because they have to have something. What's missing there? Cohabitation. Absolutely, common law marriage. You don't have a, well, I mean, I guess they'll count that as a marriage, but yeah. The people who are living there that aren't blood related, but are still family. Anything else missing? Like a lot, right? Basically. So legally, we define a family as sharing a common residence. So, you know, once lawyers get involved, everything gets more complicated. But we now say like, okay, if you share a household, you might be considered family. If you have economic interdependency. So if it's my husband's cousin's kid, but I pay his bills, there's an economic interdependence. And then, of course, stability and commitment, which is way too much to ask. But that's how they do it. They say, like, okay, if these things happen, this person can be legally defined as family. Again, lots of things missing from there, right? And then, of course, like we've talked about, theoretically, family can be so much more complicated. And it can't be put into words. There's just no way.
What about foster children?
Huh?
What about foster children?
What about foster children? Or do we count them?
How do you count them?
They're not family.
Well, I understand this, but couldn't they be considered under the economic part?
Maybe. That's a good question.
You know, you're providing for them and everything like that.
Yeah, maybe so. That's why the definitions are so hard to come up with, because they are inherently limited. Theoretically, this is what has, in the 1940s, this is what was come up with. Group of persons united by the ties of marriage, blood, or adoption, constituting a single household, so living together, common domicile, interacting and communicating with each other in their respective social roles. A lot to ask. How often do you not to talk to your family? And creating and maintaining a common culture, which I think is an important part too. The culture of a family can cause people to feel more connected. So that's better, right? Is there something missing from it?
Wow.
A lot, of course. Yeah. I still get hung up on that sharing a single household. What about military families? What about families where a parent or a child is incarcerated? What about families where someone is in a hospital, a long-term care facility? Once we send grandma to the nursing home, is she no longer family? That's what's missing. But really the whole point of all of this is just help you understand how hard it is to understand families and define them. Hess, much more recently, said a range of household structures that meet people's needs at various points in their lives and that are forced on various points in their lives that are forced on them by circumstances. So everyone's trying to come up with a definition, but it's really hard to do. And sometimes I think like, maybe I'll ask you to come up with a definition, and I'm like, no, that's too hard to do. But I might on a quiz, so start thinking about it. Also has said a consuming unit, so that's where consumption economics come in. Highly dependent on the economic system beyond their home, over which the family members have little control. So this is pretty close to a good part of a definition, right? Families are dependent on the economy. That dictates how much milk costs. That dictates how much gas costs. That dictates if you can go on vacation or not. So I like that. I like that as part of a definition. And then the AFCS, which some of you may be a member of, 2 or more persons who share resources, share responsibility for decisions, share values and goals, and have a commitment to one another over time. So that's a little more the PC one, because we're like, we can't narrowly define it, but here are some things that should be present in a family, basically. Questions, comments? All right, so in our book, there are a couple different definitions. There's an economic unit. There's some sort of economic dependency that's trying to meet the needs of everybody in the family. It's 2 or more people, so again, limiting it, one person cannot be a family. Self-identify as part of a family, so if I say you're my family, you're my family. Maybe whether you like it or not, I don't know. And who are significantly attached to that unit, and commitment to maintaining that group over time. I think that's important, because if I'd rather you weren't my family, maybe I'd kick you out, maybe I'd cut you out, and maybe that's the best thing to do. But I like that's included in there. Here we've talked about already some of the gray areas. Cohabitation, how do we define that? It's so much more common now than it used to be. Domestic partners, we're not gonna get married, but we're gonna live together. Either because we can't legally get married, or it's kind of a lot of paperwork, or there would be financial implications for doing so. And then also, like, do I define family the same way as my family defines family, basically? So we've talked about the potential issues. We'll skip through that. How changes in the family have gone about and happened. So in 2001, there was this National Marriage Project, which I'm sure you're all familiar with because you read the book. But since then, so that's 18 years ago, some of you are maybe just 18, I don't know, maybe close to 19, but some of you, this is like when you were born kind of stuff. Americans less likely to marry. Why? Why would people be less likely to marry in more recent times than they were in the past?
Focusing on career.
Okay. So Choosing career instead of marriage, maybe. Also delaying. We know people tend to delay marriage for career, but like, I'm not gonna get married. How many of you know someone who said that, like, I'm never getting married? What are their reasons? They don't want kids? Okay, so they feel like if they get married, there's gonna be pressure to have kids?
Financially too, isn't there something with the taxes that it's, I don't know, I have a nephew who doesn't want to get married and it's something like he'll make more money by staying single than, I don't know how they manipulate that, but.
He should talk to his CPA, because actually you get some pretty good discounts for being married. But sure, maybe there's some sort of financial reason.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't want you to get my money, and I don't want a prenup. What else? Okay, so kind of the whole like philosophical thing of it doesn't change anything, it's just a piece of paper, and then I'm like stuck with you. It's harder to get rid of you. Okay,
Independence.
independence, like I don't need
Be
someone.
accountable.
Okay, I want to be accountable. Ooh, you can be married and totally not accountable, right? But yeah, people think that. All right. Any other reasons thinking about like 2001? Like,
I have friends that they didn't like the idea of giving into like, because society sets you up for your household and then your kids and then you live your life working.
okay. Yeah, so kind of more, again, that philosophical thing of like, I'm not going to get married just because people think I should get married. I'm not going to get married just because that's what we expect. So yeah, you know, if you remember back in the day when Brad and Angelina were together, they're not together anymore, right? And they weren't going to get married until gay marriage was legal, because they were like, you know, it was kind of like taking a stand. But then they got married anyhow before gay marriage was legal, so it totally blew it. But yeah, so sometimes there's a political statement involved.
I was gonna say a lot of families in the divorce rate, maybe they saw their own family fall apart and they just don't want to do it.
Maybe they're
Risk it.
scared. Absolutely, I think it's a big part of it. They're scared. They're like, well, my parents got divorced and it sucked. I don't want to go through that. Yeah. Sometimes it's a matter of if someone's been previously married. I know a situation where this person was married, the person died, and so now she and her child are receiving his pension and Social Security, but if she gets married, she loses it. So she's totally married, but not legally, because she would lose that financial support. So there's economic things like that too that happen that are kind of weird. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons. And thinking about 2001, that was a while ago, but it wasn't that long ago. People are less likely to marry. The divorce rate has doubled since 1960, which we know. And actually, I don't necessarily see that as a negative thing. I kind of feel like maybe more people are empowered to leave bad relationships than they used to be. So I kind of see that as like a feminist kind of thing. But number of unmarried couples has increased, so cohabitation. I remember when I was in grad school, so here getting my master's, 2000. I wrote a paper about cohabitation, and it was like so taboo. Like everyone was talking bad about cohabitation, and it was terrible. It was going to ruin your life, this kind of stuff. Yeah, we've gotten over that now. But there was a very strong belief about that. Like, you can't cohabitate. And if you do, you're living in sin. Like, it was a whole thing. We don't have that as much anymore. But that is one of the reasons people are still coupling. It's just not formally marriage. So we have to recognize that. It's not like people aren't getting together. It's just that they're not taking that legal step to say they're married. Presence of children has declined since 2001. So fewer couples having children. And again, there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them are economic. Some of them are just kind of like, I don't like kids, or I don't want kids, or I can't have kids. But we have seen households get smaller. The number of children growing up without fathers has increased, which is something to pay attention to. It's something for us to understand more about. Again, I don't necessarily say, oh, this is a bad thing. Perhaps it is that more women are feeling empowered to leave bad relationships and to not put their children in a home with someone who's abusive. That's probably just a little piece of it though. What are the other reasons? Because we know children need fathers. They need male role models and father figures in their lives. So that's something we gotta pay attention to, and we gotta say, ooh, we gotta do something about that. Doesn't mean just stay with someone you don't love, but it means how do we supplement that? How do we find those father figures and those role models for those children? And then adolescents are way more accepting of alternatives to marriage than their parents were, their grandparents were. So culturally, we have kind of been like, yeah, you don't have to get married. Like, okay. Whereas in the past, that was like the exception. Everyone had to get married or else you were like fundamentally flawed. So that is the good news. Things are changing for the better, mostly. The things that families provide to us, they give us a sense of belonging, like it or not, especially if you share a name, right? There's a strong theme for people who want to carry on their family name. In my family, me and my cousins are all girls. So my maiden name dies with us. Don't worry about it, my sister had a child out of wedlock, so the name's gonna continue. But like, had she gotten married, changed her last name and had a new child, his name would have been her married name, not her maiden name. And that name would have, for our branch of the family, gone away. Some people really care about that. That was a big deal for my dad. So having that connection to something greater than ourselves, even if it's as simple as sharing a name, can be a big deal. Feeling like, you know what, they gotta love me because they're my family. I belong here. These are my people. These people get me. That's all part of it. Emotional security, like in an ideal situation, if you're upset, you can reach out to family and they will love you and give you a hug and that kind of thing. Physically, they give you shelter. Maybe they put gas in your car. If you go to the doctor, they'll go with you, maybe. Economically, we've talked about, and then of course, just socialization. You never really realize how weird your family is until you interact with other families. And you're like, guys are like, what? But that's really what we get from our family primarily. We learn our traits and our habits and our weird things about ourselves, but we think they're normal. And then we go out and interact with other families and we're like, y'all are crazy. So these are the main functions that families provide, and we'll go into a little more detail, but that's what I want you to just kind of think about. Like, there's benefit to having family. I don't care who's in it, but these are things we need. Let's get through some of this. You can read this on your own. This is worth touching on, but we won't spend a lot of time because we talk about it a lot. Culture impacts the way we define and evaluate our relationships. So our race and ethnicity impact families and how we see our families, our religion, our politics, and our economics. So think of an example of one of those. How do one of these cultural things shape our families? How do politics shape our families? Morals and values? How so? Like how so?
Like, if you were raised in a democratic household, your values may be different.
Okay, sure, yeah. So what do we believe about an individual's right to have an abortion? What do we believe about someone's right to own guns? Yeah, that starts from a family. That's where we get some of those early messages, absolutely. What else? Yeah.
It can kind of divide families, because I know, like race-wise, my mom married a white guy, and my grandpa was mad about it for a really long time.
Sure, absolutely. So if a family has a strong reason to, or not reason, because it's not a good reason, but if they believe that shouldn't be interracial marriage, that could break a family apart. Okay, absolutely. Or cause someone to not marry someone they love because their family will have a hard time with it. Absolutely. I think that's getting better, but it's still not as good as it should be. What about who can get married?
Yeah.
That's a political decision, right?
It's also a religious decision.
It's also a religious decision, and let's not pretend that those aren't intertwined as much as they're not supposed to be. Absolutely. Our politics tell us who can be married. Gay marriage just barely got passed in some places. That's a huge shaping of families. Now we're moving into talk about transgender rights and things like that. Those politics impact families. Even adoption, when we talk about historically, there's been a strong resistance to allowing interracial adoption even. And there's still a very big stigma against that. If it comes to choosing between a family of the same race or ethnicity as the child and different one, the bias is going to be towards that family, the same race or ethnicity, even if there are greater protective factors in this family. So it's still something we struggle with because we know culture is important, and we know it's important for children who are adopted cross-culturally to have a touch point with their culture of origin. But sometimes we're making those decisions based on that alone and not considering other factors. So these things very much shape our families. And the reason that's a problem is that it changes. Once someone new gets elected, we reverse our previous policies. Try to get rid of Roe versus Wade now because we have different politicians in place. Some people are like, yes, it's about time. And some people are like, oh my God, no, we fought so long to get this right. So these are constantly changing. Another reason that it's so hard to understand families and work with them or be in a family because things change. You can't count on your economic situation being the same. If we hit another recession, which it looks like we're heading into, how's that going to affect families? Back during our last recession, a lot of people were about ready to retire. Then guess what? Stock market. Guess what? You can't retire because your retirement account just crashed too. So people are working longer, putting off their retirement plans because of the economy. So these are things that absolutely impact us and our families, but they also change over time. That's why it's important that we continue to learn and continue to know things, because what you learn today is going to be obsolete 5 years from now. I can't teach this class the same way I did 5 years ago because the information changed. That's why we were having such a hard time with textbooks, because they're so old by the time they're published. Their information is out of date. Our textbook has stuff from 2010. That's pretty new, but that was 9 years ago. So that's why I focus more on how you apply stuff and how you learn stuff than memorizing statistics, because memorizing statistics helps you today, but who cares 5 years from now when you're in your career? So recognizing this, recognizing the value and how culture affects families, and recognizing how it's constantly changing, so we have to keep up with it. Here's just an example of, someone mentioned political differences, like if you're raised in a Democratic household and you might be a Republican, like that's not always something that's tolerated. This is a book, Love and War. I don't know, does anyone know these people? James Carville, especially, his name goes through a lot. They have become kind of media darlings because they are very actively involved in the political spectrum from the top with the president, but they are staunch opposites politically. So the nice thing about it is that they have been able to kind of come out and say like, hey, you can successfully have a relationship with someone who you don't fundamentally agree with. And I think that's something that we can all learn from, because people kind of assume like, no, if someone's values are so very different from your own, there's no way it can work. It can. Doesn't mean you have to. You may say like it's not worth it, but this is just a nice example. If you are interested in politics and that kind of thing, you can read more about it and hear more about it, because they are a couple that's very much in the spotlight, having done it. Let's see here. Interracial marriages, we talked about how they're more accepted now, but just barely. So There's a slight increase in acceptance of it, but it's still a problem. This blows my mind sometimes. We're here at a university, so we tend to have a more open-minded kind of mentality about interracial relationships. You go over to Silver City, they don't. And I'm not, if you're from Silver City, I'm just picking on it because it's a small town, but small town America still may very much not accept it. So we also have to understand, just because our experience, we accept it and we know that people around us accept it. When we look at overall context, it's still something that's very slowly getting accepted. Interfaith marriages, which sometimes I think are even more controversial than interracial, because you can't control your race, right? You can control your faith. So people who get married who have different, you know, a lot of what we see, what I see in my practice is someone who's Christian or some sort of religious person and they're dating an atheist. And they're like, oh, I don't know if I can be with this person. If you don't believe in God, how do I do that? What does that mean? But I really like them. So we are seeing an increase in that because I think people are talking more and recognizing like it doesn't have to ruin a relationship, but you have to know how to negotiate it. You have to know how to talk about it. It becomes more complicated when children are involved. A lot of people are totally fine with interfaith marriages until it comes time to have kids, and how are we going to raise them? Are they going to be baptized? Are we going to have a brisk for them? Those kinds of things. That's where it gets harder. Yes?
Me and my current boyfriend, we're together for 2 years now, and we are very different with our beliefs. And since we've been together, we've kind of helped each other like see from other perspectives. And it's kind of like, not fully, but a little bit kind of, not only given perspective, but changed a little bit of our opinion on certain things. And we didn't see things in certain ways like we did before.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's if you're able to have the conversations and able to like just acknowledge it and talk about it, it doesn't have to ruin a relationship. But some churches can't get married in a Catholic church if you're not Catholic, right? That's a problem for a lot of people who are like, I love this person, I want to spend the rest of my life with them, but I also want to get married in my church. And they're not willing to do, well, and you don't have to be Catholic, but you have to promise to raise your children Catholic, from what I understand. I'm not Catholic. So, like, that's a thing. People have to negotiate that, and it's not even their own choices now. It's their values and their culture that's saying you can or can't do this. So, beyond just getting married, religious orientation affects everything, especially here. Again, we kind of get caught up in our culture here in New Mexico, here in Las Cruces, very strong Catholic faith, very strong values as far as religion, spirituality goes. So we kind of don't even think about it. But then you go somewhere that's different and you're like, wait, what? How do you guys do things? I went to Virginia Tech, like there's a church on every corner.
Mm.
I mean, it is just like, and it's not, do you go to church? It's where do you go to church? So when you're in that environment, it changes things too. So we always want to recognize when we're working with families that religion plays a big part. Religion, and I like to say spirituality, but more so religion because it's formalized and has an awful lot of rules attached to it. Spirituality doesn't have nearly as many rules. So that affects a lot of decisions. Money, how does religion impact money?
Tithing.
Tithing. Y'all know what tithing is? 10% goes to the church off the top of your paycheck. That is what a tithe is. They pass offering plate, you put some money in it. Or nowadays, because of technology, you put a little thing on your app and you send in your offering. And people do. They give 10% of their income. Which, if you're making 90 grand, it's $9,000 a year. You're making 20 grand, $2,000 a year. Do you have $2,000 a year? Give to the church? Maybe, maybe not. It gets complicated. It gets really hard to think about. How else does religion affect decisions about money? I mean, let's make no mistake. Churches are financial machines. They have to be. They gotta pay the bills, right? But think of other ways. We've got tithing, but there's also other obligations, right?
Building fund.
The building fund, the potlucks. What about things like, oh, if I have to attend church, I can't pick up an extra shift on Sunday morning. So I have to reconcile my need to get to work with this obligation I feel to be at church. And again, we've got apps now, so you can go to work and watch church on your phone if you want to. But religion affects decisions about money, most definitely about children. We talked about that. Should we have children? How many children should we have? How should we raise those children? Our social networks, a lot of people's social networks come from church, which can be good or bad, depending. And then, of course, relationship issues too. If I am a religious person and I decide that, you know what, I need to be true to myself and I need to come out and recognize that I'm homosexual, am I still going to be welcome at my church? Those are huge issues for people. Very complicated stuff. So when we're working with families, we need to talk about it. We need to understand what, if any, their faith is and how that affects their life in all these different ways. And this is, so far we're talking about it in terms of the assumption that the family all agrees on this kind of stuff. What if the spouse doesn't agree with tithing 10% and finds out you've been doing it anyhow? Then you've got a bigger problem. So very much we cannot pretend or deny the fact that religion plays a huge role in families, and we got to pay attention to it. So let's move quickly. I'm just going to touch on these again about research with the family. And by touch on it, I mean I'm going to tell you what they are and you're going to read it on your own because we only have a few minutes left. Family systems theory, super important. This is the core of marriage and family therapy. This is what we very strongly believe in. And basically it says when something happens to one person, everyone's affected. You guys have heard of like the butterfly effect? Like if a butterfly flaps its wings, it can change the tides in another ocean or something like that. Basically it says everything is connected. We don't live in a vacuum. And when we see people like that, we understand so much more depth about them. Again, you know, we were talking about last week, like if you're really good at something, people see you as that. And they may forget that, oh yeah, but you're also really good at these other things. So you become this like two-dimensional thing. But when we consider your systems, we understand, hey, you may be good at this, but you're a great member of this community and you do this and that and the other. So everything is connected and everyone has multiple dimensions to their life. You know, we come in here and you guys are all sitting here and you're students. So you sit here, you do what you're supposed to do, you turn in your homework and you go home. And I could see you as that. I could see you falling asleep in class and think, man, you're a terrible student. I could see you on your phone and think, God, how disrespectful. Or I could understand that you have so much more to your life than just sitting in this room twice a week. Maybe you're tired because you worked all night, or because you were up fighting all night, or drinking all night. Maybe there's a reason you're falling asleep in class. Maybe you're on your phone because you're dealing with a personal crisis right now. You might be playing Candy Crush too. I'm not stupid. But if I don't give you the benefit of the doubt and I make a judgment about you based on right now, I'm missing all that other stuff in your life. Maybe you're late a lot. So I think, man, this person doesn't have their life together. They're late all the time. Or I think, man, this person's needing to ride the city bus and the city bus is late. So they're late because of that. Like if we understand that there are so many more systems that we're all involved with, it helps us to be a lot more empathetic. Sometimes you are just late because you're like, yeah, whatever, I don't want to be here. I get that too. I don't care. I'm not judging you. Like you make your grown-up decisions and you do your thing. But I also want you to start thinking about that stuff too. When you see the person and you're like, pretty sure they wore that shirt last time, the time before. Like, maybe it's their Tuesday shirt, y'all. You don't know. But when we recognize systems, that's what we recognize, that it's so much bigger than just one slice of someone's life. There are all these other things that impact it. That is like, duh, but so many people don't get that. So many people think you are an individual and that's all there is to you. So that's why family systems we use in family studies and marriage and family therapy, because it's like, and it was 1968 when this came out. Like before that, people didn't formalize that thought. So look at this, just quick example of, this is a genogram. This is basically like, we call them family trees. Maria is severely strained in her grandmother role. She's strained because she has to care for Juan's mother. She's guilty because she's not being a good mother to, she's got married children. She's not a good mom to them. Her college son is an athlete. She's not a good mother to him. She's not a good daughter to her widowed mother. She's not kind of preserving her memory. She is a daughter-in-law to Juan's parents, and now she's caring for one of those parents. So she's like, I kind of suck all around, right? And then we kind of sit down with her and we're like, yeah, you don't suck all around. Your situation does though. Look at all this stress. Look at all these expectations that we have. You've got a dead mom, you're probably grieving that. You got a kid in college who's an athlete, you probably don't get to go to his games as much as you would like to. You probably don't know what's going on in his life as much anymore. You got grandkids, do you ever get to see them? But you're too tired because you're dealing with this mother-in-law who you may hate, we don't know. So family systems get super complicated, and we just really want to recognize that and remember it. And when we're working with families, we want to understand their system. We want to know more than just, how come you're not doing well in my class? Because ultimately, that's my only responsibility. But if I do that, and I'm like, well, I don't care if you don't have food to eat, still come to class, like, I'm missing something. So that's a good, just little example. Another theory that we use to understand families, and we'll talk about a lot, is social exchange theory. Everyone is all about give and take. So we are assigning power to people who have something that we need. And we do this all the time. So basically, if I get something out of our interactions, I'm more motivated to continue those interactions. Whether that's, it's financial, but this is more the social part. Like if I enjoy talking to you, if I feel supported by talking to you, I'm gonna wanna talk to you more. If every time I talk to you, I feel drained and like, it's just like you pouring out everything and not asking how I'm doing, I don't want to further that relationship. So we think about it as kind of a bartering system, like what am I giving and receiving by having a relationship with someone? And we don't necessarily think of it that formally, but once we do, we realize like, whoa, this person is no good for me. This person is draining me and I'm not getting anything out of it. That gives us the power to leave those relationships, to put in good boundaries so that these people, we don't answer the phone every time they call, because then they start texting, why aren't you answering my call? Are you mad at me? I really need to talk to you. We say, hey, I'm not available right now. Talk to you later. So that's why social exchange theory is important, and we'll definitely talk more about it. Symbolic interactionism, if we read through on your own, I don't think we'll use it a whole lot in our examples or anything, but it's a good one to know. Conflict theory, yeah. Basically, what you want to know in this is that conflict is inevitable. You can't avoid it. You can't get around it. You can pretend it's not there, but conflict is part of the human experience. Conflict comes from three competing needs, or from three needs: competition, coercion, or conflict. So when those things, when we're trying to figure out power in a family, we're either going to get it by competing for it, I'm going to coerce you into giving it to me, or we're going to fight about it. That's how we negotiate power, because power is a real thing that someone has to have. We want to have power. We want to have someone who has power over us. There's all these complicated notions with it, but basically, when you look at social relationships, you're looking at power. So we will talk a lot more about that, and you start to think about that in your own lives. Like, who has the power in my life? Do I always answer the phone because I don't want them to be mad at me? Or do I say, like, send a voicemail? But not really send a voicemail, because then they know you did. So you just let it ring until it ends the call, right? All of that's power. And we'll talk a lot about power, because it's not just economic, but there is an economic situation. Whoever brings in the money has more power, unless they don't. So conflict theory, basically just know it's inevitable. It's a part of our life. Feminist theory, this one's a little bit hard to describe, because you may have a notion of it in your head where it's like, you know, don't shave my armpits, burn my bra kind of thing. And there are absolutely feminists who believe that, and more power to them. But it's much more just saying, very simply, there are things in this world that are unfair. And a lot of those things are based on gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, intellectual abilities, all these different things. So the emphasis primarily was on female experiences as this evolved, because we're trying to get women the right to vote, you know, get them equal pay and stuff like that. But it's beyond that. It's not just feminists. Recognizing that minorities, disadvantaged people, women, et cetera, are subordinate in social arrangements. Saying, like, we recognize this happens and we want to do something about it. And that's all there is to it. It's not man-hater club. It's not we need to oppress men to get even. It's not that. It's simply saying, like, hey, this is something that's happening. How can we change it? And just as many men are feminists as women. Because not all men are like, oh no, I want to be in charge and dominant. Some men are like, hey, that kind of sucks for you. Like, I have a mom. I get it. So, very important. And this is something that you'll hear a lot from me, because I am someone who believes strongly in feminism. But again, I have my conflicts with it too, because I'm not like an abrasive, in-your-face, protesting feminist, which is a whole category of feminism that's important. It just doesn't fit with my personality. But we will talk a lot when we talk about things that are unfair. That's what we're talking about there. Ecological theory, this is basically, you know, how we all work within those systems, how we branch out beyond our family and learn things and bring them back to our family. So it's, you know, the kind of the bullseye type mentality that we'll talk a lot about. And finally, I will end with family strength framework, which basically says we want to focus on what's right with the family. We want to identify and foster family strengths, instead of just focusing on the deficit model that says, what's wrong with this family? What do we need to change? What's broken? Because when we focus on strengths, our resources are better, and we actually have a lot better outcomes. So we're always looking at balance here. We're always looking at, yeah, you're really struggling right now, but let's talk about what's going well. Let's talk about the things you're doing right. Because if you can recognize and do more of those, struggle gets easier to handle. So those are the major qualities we're looking for. Commitment to families, spending time together, spiritual well-being, management in stress or crisis situations, communicating positively, showing appreciation and affection. We want to talk to families about, but look at this, like you all have family dinner every Sunday. That's amazing. Hey, you guys have that family group text where you guys just share stuff with each other and get support. Awesome. So really helping family to figure out what's going well, instead of simply, you know, it's that whole like, we either treat an illness or we focus on wellness and prevent the illness. That's the same kind of mentality there. So family strengths, again, will be interwoven through everything we talk about. Development, talk about that later. And then research design, I'm not going to bore you with. So that's that. I will see you guys all on Tuesday. Make sure you read chapter 3 for next week. And we have a quiz next Thursday.